Hey, so I just finished work on my newest short film, which I guess would fit under the genre label of psychological horror, but I prefer shit I just made up. And I'll get into why, because here in this video I want to go over the process of making it. For context, I'm not the world's most experienced filmmaker. I only have a couple of basic shorts under my belt, so if you're looking for great knowledge and perspective, this isn't necessarily the place for that. But I want to make videos like this both as a way of cataloging my methods and progress, but also I think it's just fun to talk from the perspective of someone who has far from all the answers, because that's fun, why not? And I thought this specifically would make for an interesting topic for a video, and not because it's some great masterwork that needs to be dissected, but because the way I made it was a little bit weird. Rather than just writing and shooting it like I normally would, I wrote it and shot one scene of it, and then proceeded to shelve it for 11.5 months before reviving it with some new scenes and some new ideas, and this is the end result. So it was more or less a process of reconfiguring an old idea to just make it work, and maybe it did, I don't know. Obviously, to get the most out of this video, I recommend you watch the full short, for context. But if you don't want to, just let me get into it. So this is going to be the whole thing from the initial idea all the way to calling it done, which happened just recently. I'm going to take you back to the past. The fall of 2020-21. So at the time, I was working on my second serious attempt at a short film, and that was The Sliding Worlds. That was, at the time, the biggest project I had done, and I decided that once I finished that and the video I was going to make about it, I wanted to go instantly and shoot a new short film, so I came up with an idea. An idea I could start production on as soon as The Sliding Worlds was done. This new idea would center around a guy named David who wakes up one morning to find another guy named Al sitting on the floor by his bed with a weird container, and then weirdness ensues. It all hinged on the idea that Al would be in David's room, and he would know something that David did that David doesn't quite remember, something horrible. That there was this approaching inescapable horror on the edge of David's memory. This notebook right here was where I wrote down the initial idea in just a bunch of random fragments. I'll spare you my skeletal handwriting, but I had it written down as Cannibal 1. That was the working title, Cannibal 1. So I just noted the bullet points of the first scene, and then noted that I wanted a shot with a red filter eventually in the short, and that was all I had to start with. In reading this again for the first time in almost a year, it kind of shocked me how pretty much everything that happens in the first scene happened in the short completely unchanged. The only thing that did change was I initially wanted the container to be a white to-go box, like for food, but every time I got one of those, I forgot to save it, so it's just a pot with aluminum foil over it in the finished product. So I just took the ideas I had written in here and took it to the screenwriting software Faden, which has a really wonderful free version. And no, this video is not sponsored, but come on, Faden, if you want to sponsor someone. After having those initial bullet points for the first scene, I didn't do any additional outlining or planning for the rest of the short. I just kind of thought I would pull it out of thin air. So for the screenplay version, I gave it the working title of A Visit and a Pact with Cannibals. Because there was originally, I thought I would work the idea of a pact in there some way, but, that never happened. Really what it was that I decided that the container was going to be full of human remains from somebody killed by David and Al, but, the pact never came through. I ended up taking the story to 4 additional scenes. Let me just read the wonderful synopsis that I have written up right here. After Al left David's room, there would be a scene outside where David would walk around in seclusion, and the editing and his movements would gradually pick up at the pace, become more aggressive. He'd start hitting himself. We'd get quick glimpses of bloodied body parts and a blade, and close-ups of David and Al in darkness. Then, while all that's going on, an additional series of clips of the container being on David's bed, with him slowly approaching it, eventually opening it to reveal a bright mess of red and meat. So there would be these 3 sequences running together at the same time. It absolutely would have been a headache to edit, but that's not why it was cut. And we'll get all into what was cut and why in a minute. Going back to the synopsis, he'd then wait outside at night, and I wanted this shot of a white wall with a light casting a big shadow. Then a foot would stomp into frame. That would be Al. Then it would cut to the 2 in an old barn, which we saw flashes of earlier, and David would end up murdering Al. There'd be a red filtered shot of him eating something, and he'd look at the camera, and then we'd cut to his room at night, revealing to him to be dead. Amid, all those events, I had decided that throughout the short, David would provide a whispered voiceover commentary, and this was very much inspired by the Jean-Luc Godard movie, The 2 or 3 Things That I Know About Her, which isn't necessarily one of my favorite movies of all time, but I really liked the way narration was in that movie, so, I stole it. J'en déduis que le pouvoir gaulliste prend le masque d'un réformateur et d'un modernisateur. I don't like to begin with waking up. It's too ordinary. So, in December of 2021, I made a shot list. This was done through the simple method of going into Google Docs and then breaking up all the shots in chronological order for each one. So it would be a list of shots that's me on camera, a list of shots that's my brother on camera, and then a list of shots of inserts and then wides. The individual type of shots were done chronologically, but everything was out of order depending on, what it was. So by the time we had shot my last scene, we were on to his scenes, with wides and inserts being done last. So in January of 2022, we shot this first scene between David and Al, and it was glorious. So glorious it never got finished. I'll go over the actual details of making this scene later, but we're still in the historical recap part of the video. So that scene was shot, and I wanted to shoot the rest as soon as possible. The first delay came from the fact that there simply wasn't enough time at the time to shoot the scenes with me and my brother at the same time. So after a few weeks of waiting for that to work out, I just decided I would shoot as much as I possibly could by myself, and then just drag him along to get shots as quickly as possible so this thing could actually be made. I never really got around to that one. God, I wish I had gotten some water before I started recording. Really, I just kept putting it off for reasons like, oh, the light's bad outside today. Oh, it's too windy to get these shots. But if I'm being totally honest, getting all the shots, specifically the ones outside by myself in a way that was clear and had the effect that I wanted to, just seemed extremely daunting and impossible to me at the time. Mainly because even with gathering a shot list together, I couldn't figure out how to get it in a clear and concise way. So February went by with no progress made on the shorts, so at some point that month I decided, hey, since I'm waiting to be able to finish consumption, why don't I just make something by myself in the meantime? I wrote and shot a script called The Red Cube and filmed it in March and April, and it was done by, June or something? You can watch that up here. Would YouTube cards be over there? I don't know, but you can watch it if you want. I never stopped wanting to finish consumption, but after getting busy with the Red Cube and other YouTube projects, it just kind of slipped further and further away. Then the area I wanted to use outside had become overgrown since it wasn't winter anymore and all the plants weren't dead. Then in the summer I started a job, and then in fall I was working on other stuff at the time as well. So the whole year just kind of flew by and I never got around to finishing consumption. I could have if I really tried, but I didn't. Something just wasn't clicking, and sometimes that happens with creative projects. It isn't always just necessarily laziness. Sometimes you just kind of lose the thread, and it simmers in the back of your mind until the subconscious grabs like a little line and tugs and say, hey, do this now. That's what happened. Towards the middle of September, I decided I was going to finish consumption. So I guess that technically would have been late summer, but whatever. The first scene and the ending would be left in totally unchanged, but everything else had to go. So I punched up a new climactic scene taking place in a derelict room. David would be drawn to the container as before, and rather than seeing inside, we would only see him open it and being stricken with terror and vomiting blood. Thanks to cherry pie filling. That comes back later. Al would appear as a silent apparition. David murders him. We get a red filtered shot of David eating something. Then we'd cut to David in his bed, dead as written in the first version of the short. I felt like that kept the initial vibe and purpose of the original short, but it was just far more condensed and effective. Once I got to the crisp month of it was November. I punched up a shot list using a similar method as before, and I went strictly off that while filming. I didn't have the script with me, but since there was no dialogue in the scene, as long as I knew what shots I needed, I could just go off my memory for the rest of it. I shot that scene in an evening, then I shot the final scene a few days later, and then I was ready to go. But it really didn't seem right, and I thought, well, whatever, I have all the footage, so in early December I started editing the whole thing together. And that was the first time since January that I had even really looked at this footage of the first scene, which was a huge mess for reasons I'll get into later.
An hour.
No, it's not.
It has. We started at 12:32. It's 12:33.
Wait. But as I worked through it, I still felt something was missing. Everything was wrong. And I came to the conclusion that I needed another new scene. I knew I wanted to bridge the gap between the two main sections of the short, and I could use it as an opportunity to shine a light on the symbolic motifs I was gravitating towards. Because really, in its current state at the time, it felt far too bare and brief. Bare and brief, that could be like boxer shorts. The first idea I had would be David and Al sitting at a table, having some mundane but slightly weird conversation, and David would be eating a bowl of cereal, and then suddenly he would say something, or Al would say something that would jog his memory, and he'd look down, and the bowl of cereal would just be, guts. It's just a typical day. But then I had a second idea which I liked much better, and it would use the barn that I initially planned to use, but this scene would only be David and I could use it to accomplish a couple of things. First thing is the idea of eating, it's called cannibalism, and two, the box cutter, but also for fun. In the big scene, I used cherry pie filling as blood, and it was very obviously cherry pie filling, so I thought, why not, work that in? Why not play into that by introducing a cherry pie into the story? So David will cut into a cherry pie with a box cutter, and he'd take a bite, and then he'd look down to reveal the cherry pie becoming an overflowing mess. So I thought that was kind of fun. And third, probably most importantly, the first scene could be explained as just a simple breaking and entering, but this would pull short into a more overtly psychological direction before going into the climax. I took a lot of inspiration from both the incredible sandbox sequence in the end of Evangelion and the, everything in Eraserhead. And between those 2 points of inspiration, I came up with the idea of having the heavy grain to symbolize it's maybe not real, and then also the heavy droning sounds, which pretty obviously was inspired by Eraserhead. So ironically, the most abstract scene in the short was the most calculated and strategic, which isn't to say it's like some masterful writing on my part. But more so, I want to get across the idea of it's important to be attentive to the quirks and details of your project, so that way you can put emphasis on them and spin them to your advantage. Results may vary, but it's a heck of a lot fun to make stuff this way. And besides, building that self-awareness about what you're making at any given moment is deathly important. So I scurried down to that barn, and it was freezing cold, and shot it in about an hour. So now, at this point, it was like mid-December, and I had everything, like for real this time, so I could finish the short. And by this point, what had started as an obligation to finish something so that footage wouldn't go to waste, had turned into what was an incredibly fun creative exercise of throwing stuff at a wall to make something work. The distance between me and that first scene that time had created had made me see it less as the first scene of my new short film, and more so as an already existing foundation to build upon and tinker with. Partially, I have to say, I think the short fell through the cracks the way that it did, because that first scene really ain't all that great. I still really enjoy how bare bones and awkward the interaction is, but it's all down to how it was shot. Just clearly rushed, really. A lot of these shots very obviously needed refined, a lot of them are out of focus, and most frustratingly, the lighting is awful. Specifically, when we were sitting on the floor, the shots are super underexposed and lack any shape to the lighting, which not only, looks lame, but it absolutely cooked the colors, pretty much killing any options for color grading. The bare bones dialogue, as well as having the voiceover that needed to be added, also created an unexpected challenge. So since all the dialogue was shot out of order, it felt like assembling just a mess of a puzzle, and I was constantly unsure of if I would have enough footage to even make this comprehensible. Which was something I'd picked up on after I'd shot it, and was also part of why I was afraid to get into editing this, because I was afraid it'd be like, oh, this was for nothing. I had no idea what shot went where. One great instance of this, I originally intended a sequence to happen later where a shot of David and Al would be overlaid over each other, and David would close his eyes and Al would open his, so it would look like Al was looking through David's eyes. I ended up not using that idea, but thankfully I had shot the footage for it, because there's a moment at the end of the scene where Al leaves the room and David gets up and he runs at the door. And yeah, that had to happen, but I just kind of forgot to film any connective tissue between Al getting up and leaving and David acknowledging that before going running. So I had to repurpose this shot of David closing his eyes as this bizarre Band-Aid solution. And I was so far into this project that I could not tell if that was ridiculous or fantastic, but I kind of like how bizarre it is.
I see. Yeah, I'll leave this room now.
The new scenes were mostly me working by myself, other than my brother's help with a shot or two on the derelict room scene. And I have to say, I like all this new stuff far more than what we had originally shot. The experience of having made the red cube between shooting that first scene and doing these new scenes definitely helped me have a higher level of competency, but also the creative ideals are just kind of different. These new ones lean into a more obviously horror-type tone, and the psychological aspect took far more of the stage. A while after I had written the original script, I had realized that it was a possibility that Al was not even real at all and was just a manifestation of David's repressed memory and guilt. I initially thought I was just going to leave it open to interpretation, but between shooting the first scene and doing these new scenes, I just decided that was the way it was going to be. The derelict room scene was the first one that I shot out of the new batch, and while shooting it, I just decided I was going to go with any creative whim that I had in the moment. Because again, there was so much distance between me and the initial idea at this point that I kind of felt like I was interpreting what was already there rather than writing it myself. So anything that felt right to what I was feeling about the story at any given moment went in. An example of this is this shot of the door. Literally, the camera just happened to be pointing there between shots, but something dreamy about it stuck out to me, so I left the focus as it was and went outside the room and walked back in reverse, which I then reversed in post to make it look like I was leaving. Something entirely unplanned became what I felt was essential, but that's because I got to have one shot of the empty door open right before Al appears as if he entered the room as an unseen force, and then David walks out of that same door before killing Al. And a couple days later, I shot this final shot in my room, and it also just took me forever to line up this shot in a way that I liked. So long, in fact, the battery on the light I was using started to die, causing the light to flicker. Which is wonderful because I love the way it looks, and that wouldn't have happened if I got the shot any faster than I did. The barn sequence is also just me freezing outside by myself, but it was a really straightforward and efficient shoot that I had a lot of fun doing, and the only thing I ended up adding was this little shot of the plant because I like the way that the ice looked. The editing process has a way of revealing the shortcomings of any project. This was also the first thing I ever edited on DaVinci Resolve over here. Look at him. And while I'm not totally used to the workflow on this thing, I really enjoyed using it. The free version is shockingly robust for something that's, free. As I said earlier, assembling the first scene was like a mess of a puzzle that got spilt on the floor. Which I guess puzzles are supposed to be, mixed up, but you get what I mean. Most notably, this took the form of just a lot of patchwork needing to be done to make the thing work. Shots between takes were used to fill out reactions to dialogue, sound had to be pulled from other clips to cover up the sounds of the camera shaking or other noises. As I've already mentioned, I really embraced the idea of letting the short itself take the reins and just going with ideas that seemed true to it, and that specifically added a lot to this derelict room part, aside from the shots of the door that I mentioned earlier. Another one was that I realized the part where David cuts Al had pretty much zero impact the way that it was filmed. So first, I took the shot of the box cutter and the pie filling and zoomed it in and double layered it, having one of the layers flashing. And earlier in the process, when I was scanning over a bunch of clips. I don't remember which one it was specifically, but scrubbing back and forth really fast made this weird, breathy, stuttering sound that I thought was weird, so I recorded it in OBS in case I wanted to use it, and sure enough, it found a place. The only interesting thing about this last shot was I had kept blinking during the shot and I'm supposed to be dead in the scene, which was a problem. So I just kind of surgically removed all the parts where I'm blinking. And since the light was flickering anyway, it kind of helped cover that up a bit and the footage was slowed down anyway, which made it easier. In my big video about my short film, The Sliding Worlds, I talked about how one of my major takeaways from that project is that Band-Aid solutions in editing is never a replacement for just getting it right on the day while you're filming. And I still feel like that's true. However, having to confront errors in a project and having to conjure up solutions to make it work as well as you can while still being, intelligible and true to the initial idea is an incredibly fun creative exercise. And not only that, but these low-stakes projects that you're making early on should be an opportunity to stretch your creative legs and try out whatever may or may not work. This fun, creative attitude, though, cannot save you when it comes to the harshly technical world of color. The color grading process is something that I admittedly only have like a surface level knowledge of, and that's certainly a blind spot I plan on further correcting on the next short film that I make. Let me tell you, in terms of color, some of these shots just straight up stink. DaVinci has a pretty different layout to color grading to Premiere, which already threw me off, but what it came down to was so many of these shots were underlit. I wanted to go with somewhat of a faded green look, which works for some shots. Others...
What the hell is that?
The less light that you capture, the less information that you have to work with. And when you have less information, then it just becomes a big muddy mess of color. I'm sure there's a more level approach I could have taken to color grading that I'm simply not aware of yet, but with my current skill set, a lot of these shots really came down to either it's going to be super green or it's going to be super red. Also, I think this probably has something to do with the monitor that I edit on, but a lot of the shots over here looked, well exposed and they look nice, but once I uploaded it to YouTube on my phone and watched it on any other screen, it looks way darker than it looked over here in a way that seems like more than just YouTube compression, but I'm not exactly sure, what to do about that. So basically, all of what I just said in like the past 2 minutes just means I need to do my homework on color grading. As mentioned earlier, I had to do a bunch of patchwork on the sound, but I also got to record a bunch of stuff for fun. The loud whooshing sound in the barn scene is the sound of me turning a hairdryer off and on repeatedly, and throughout I peppered in distorted footsteps and stomps to kind of fill out some of the silence during moments of note. And all of this was achieved by recording it on this microphone and then fooling around in the great program that is Audacity. And as much fun as I had with some of the sound, I do want to say, though, how much I love silence in filmmaking. This whole short is full of silent shots and sound ducking in and out. And yeah, some of that's, shoddy patchwork, but some of it's really intentional. Like, you believe that's intentional, right? Maybe I just got way too into Twin Peaks: The Return, but I really love when a filmmaker is willing to allow silence to play out and stick around. If you ever ask me for advice in editing, I'm going to say leave in some of the silence in the moments between dialogue and action because it's fun. I like it. I love the awkward naturalism that it provides. It feels more authentic, and I feel like it gets at the subconscious a little bit more than editing something super tightly. When it's appropriate anyways. Don't apply that to every single scene. Like, does Hard-Boiled need more silence? No, it doesn't, but you know what I mean. It's more about the willingness to keep that rather than making every scene that. Consumption isn't my favorite thing that I've made, but if there's anything I took away from the project is that I really need to look at my phone to remember what I'm going to say. Something that I took away from the project that I want to impart in this video is that sometimes it's just better. Sometimes it's better to just let things roll on intuition and creative impulse, specifically when you're learning. It more or less comes down to the acceptance that not every project has to be your next big step that floors everyone. The two things I ask myself when I'm making a short film is, one, how can I make this punchier? And secondly, and more importantly, what if I did this? What is this? I don't know. Watch and read what you're doing carefully and trim the fat. Like, seriously, when I'm editing, I'm still constantly shocked how just shaving off a couple frames off a shot can completely change the impact that a cut has. And that goes the other way too. If you pick up on an awkwardness or a flatness in something that you filmed, maybe lean into that. Maybe that's what it's supposed to be. Be self-aware enough to know what you need to take out, but be confident in your work enough that you can leave in stuff people might perceive as fat. And most importantly, if a weird idea comes to you, just see how it works. Like, seriously. Even if it takes like a couple hours to do, just, do it. Remember, the joy of being a one-man show on stuff like this is that you can take as long as you want on this stuff, and anything that you can be put in can be taken out and vice versa. Hey, just have fun, I don't know. I hope you enjoyed this video. I said this in my last video about a short film, which, hey, you could watch, by the way, but it feels inherently self-indulgent to babble on about your own project, especially with as little experience and perspective that I'm speaking with. But for me personally, I've always gotten more excitement and inspiration out of videos where a person's like, here, I made this is what happened. So, I hope this was enjoyable. So yeah, subscribe for monthly videos. This is going to be February, I absolutely promise. At some point in February, it might be the 28th. It's going to be February. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Letterboxd, and those are the socials. Those will be on the description, whatever. So yeah, have a good one. Now I'm gonna watch that back to make sure it works.